I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and I'm the director of ISSI, but in addition to that, the chair for the Center for Ethnographic Research, which is sponsoring this, as well as the Department of Sociology, which is co-sponsoring our event today. So I wanted to welcome you. I just came from class, so I'm a little tired, so I hope I get this out in some kind of coherent fashion. Because my students claimed I wasn't that coherent in the last one, so I'm hoping to do better this time. For those of you who are new, we have the format is that our speaker will address us for around 45 minutes, and then after that, open it up to questions, and I come up to help the speaker in the sense that I will take, you raise your hand, and then I'll write down where the person is, and then you'll ask your question. There'll be a cue, and then he just has to answer. And so that'll occur roughly around 5 o'clock. It's a great pleasure to welcome back a student of mine and now a friend of mine to these hallowed halls. I've known him when he was an undergraduate, knew him when he was a graduate, and now know him as a professional. And that gives me both some sense of satisfaction as well as being so humbled by the fact that I'm that old.
You look great, by the way.
for my age. Cid Martinez, who is our speaker today, is assistant professor of sociology at the University of San Diego. Professor Martinez holds a PhD from sociology here at UC Berkeley, and he was also an undergraduate here. And he also held a position as a space as part of our graduate fellows program, which is a terrific program that we have run here at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and preceded by the Institute for the Study of Social Change. He's done a lot of research, some of the areas very close to places that I've been and researched, and he is going to discuss some of the results of that research that he has done over the years, which was totally ethnographic and doing participant observation. And it all emanates from a book that he has just published, and I'm using in my undergraduate class, entitled "The Neighborhood Has Its Own Rules, Latinos and African Americans in South Central Los Angeles." Please join me in welcoming Professor Cid Martinez.
Thank you, Martin. It's an honor to be here, and I just want to thank Martin for the invitation. And I also want to thank everyone from what used to be the Institute for the Study of Social Change, now the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. This center was very instrumental in providing support for completing my dissertation, and it continued to provide support when I was working on the book. So it's a great space, and this university is very fortunate to have this space. Okay, having said that, I'm going to jump right into my talk today. And today I'm going to discuss parts of chapters from my recently released book, available on Amazon.com if you're interested. There's lots of things going on in the book, and I'm only able to touch on parts of them, and I'm going to try to connect them to a larger narrative. So the central question I want to discuss today is how residents respond to violence. The book was part of a community study, and today my observations are focused on 2 charter schools in South Central Los Angeles, neighborhood councils from South Los Angeles, and perceptions of residents, including homeowners and residents of public housing. And what I'm going to do is touch on 3 themes today. And the first thing that I'm going to touch on is I'm going to start with city politics. City politics matter a lot. And I want to show that even though blacks and Latinos are more actively involved in city politics, there's still much room in the system for participation. And so I argue that in the absence of meaningful participation, they are adversely affected by the criminal justice system. And then I want to focus on under-policing. So one of the outcomes of not having an equal amount or what's the word I'm looking for? Meaningful participation in the criminal justice system is what is often referred to as under-policing, right? So we have a lot of violence in communities. People don't feel protected. And I also want to talk about over-policing. So in the second part of the talk today, I'm going to talk about under-policing, and I want to show how it opens the door for violence and how violence shapes interracial relations. And then in the third part of the book, I want to discuss a concept that I refer to as street justice. And street justice emerges as a result of under-policing. So in neighborhoods where there's lots of violence and over-policing, we get this kind of alternative form of justice that I call street justice. And the argument is this for today, this is what I'm going to try to accomplish, is that under-policing and being under-protected produces different institutional levels of social control. And I refer to this as the signature concept for this book, and my contribution to the literature is what I call alternative governance. Okay, that's the theme for today. And so what I thought I'd do is I would read. I'm not a big fan of people who read from their books, but I think in this particular instance it's appropriate because this is the Center for Ethnographic Research, and I think it's important that you all know how I conducted the ethnography, and it's not going to come through in the talk. So I'm going to read from 2 pages from the book. To answer my question about the relationship between alternative worlds and violence, I moved to South Los Angeles in August of 2003 to 2004 to conduct an ethnography of the area. I felt that living in the community and going beyond the shotgun interviews that are common practice among sociologists was critical for understanding residents and their experiences. In addition to becoming a resident of South LA, I volunteered and attended meetings at the neighborhood councils, worked as a teaching assistant at a local charter school for youth kicked out of school for their gang-affiliated behavior, and volunteered and taught religious classes at a Catholic church. Gaining entry into the church and gang setting started with my affiliation with the neighborhood councils. After conducting preliminary fieldwork in the area, I decided that neighborhood councils would be a good place to get connected with the community. More importantly, the neighborhood councils would allow me to see how residents used formal political institutions to address local issues such as violence and crime. I was quickly accepted by many members of the South LA community. While some viewed me with deep suspicion, most were welcoming. The suspicion was understandable. Dating back before the 1965 riots, residents felt betrayed by the police, city officials, and journalists. Although most people embraced me, the distrust I encountered made me realize I needed to find a way to blend in more. I became good friends with the neighborhood council managing coordinator, a Latino male in his mid-30s, who was responsible for overseeing most of the neighborhood councils in South LA. He was surprised to find me attending meeting after meeting in some of the roughest parts of South LA. Most people from the outside the area would not dare to traverse some of the rough neighborhoods where the meetings were held. The man's friendship was invaluable. He helped me get connected to key community members, and shortly thereafter I became a volunteer with the City of Los Angeles' Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. I became well acquainted with others from the staff in his department, and I visited the office as if I worked there. And just a little short note, I always think of myself on that one episode of Seinfeld where Kramer kept showing up to this workplace, and after a while people thought he worked there even though he didn't work there. It was the same kind of thing being at the neighborhood councils. I started to attend meetings done as a volunteer, and my role as a volunteer was important because it gave me an identity, which I think is crucial for conducting ethnography. It provided me with a legitimate reason for attending meetings and being involved in the community. After attending the meetings regularly, I became more familiar with key institutions and organizations in the community. One day while working at in a Dunn satellite office located in one of the roughest parts of South LA, I decided to pay a visit to a Catholic church conveniently located right across the street. I met with the priest of this church and explained my research to him, which at the time was about Black and Latino relations. He looked at me and said, "That sounds fantastic. This is the kind of thing as a pastor I'm trying to figure out. The church used to be predominantly African American and now it's mostly Latino. We've gone through many changes and your work sounds very useful for me. I will help however I can." Later he would help me with the church in various ways. I was surprised that when one day he said, "Oh Cid, I forgot to tell you, you're going to teach confirmation class for youth. The teacher is pregnant and now she is ill, so you'll have to take over. You start next week. At this parish, I sometimes attended church 3 to 4 times on weekends. I was a good Catholic when I did that. Eventually, I realized I needed to get closer to residents to see what life was like for parishioners outside the church in their own neighborhoods. I informed the priest that I needed a place to live. He told me that he would ask around. Later, I learned that I would be living with a parishioner who resided about 4 blocks from the parish. The setting allowed me to see what life was like for parishioners inside the church and outside in their day-to-day lives. After this arrangement had continued for a few months, I was then assigned to live with another parishioner who also lived near the church. I considered living with parishioners and their residences as my third field site. As a resident, I gained first-hand insight into what neighborhood life was like. I got to see life on a daily basis during the week and on the weekends. Doing this informed me about neighborhood dynamics such as violence and about other things. More importantly, in the neighborhood of South LA allowed me to see the interplay of street life such as gang life and its relationship to the church. Finally, I was able to observe youth who were involved in gang activity by volunteering and working at 2 charter schools in South LA. Student bodies consisted primarily of Latino and African American youth between the ages of 14 and 18. These charter schools were founded by a Catholic-affiliated foundation for youth who had been kicked out of LAUSD. At the school, kids were screened before admission to determine their gang affiliation so that conflict and violence would be minimized. Many of the youth had nowhere else to go. Their behavioral history had put them in a position where they could not attend school anywhere else. For many of these youth, dropping out was their next option if they couldn't cut it at the school. I started as a volunteer teaching assistant at a campus located in the heart of South LA. I worked individually with students who needed one-to-one help, assisted teachers with various assignments, and ate lunch with the students. As the staff began to trust me, I was considered for employment at another satellite campus in South LA with the same population of students, but it was more African American. I was finally hired as a teaching assistant and worked 30 to 40 hours a week at the school. My role as an official employee gave me access to more of an insider perspective than I had as a volunteer. More importantly, I could better observe what the violence of youth were at risk of experience before and after during the school. So that's a little bit about the ethnography and how I gained access, which I think is important and oftentimes overlooked by scholars. So what I want to focus on now is the neighborhood councils. I gave a talk here a while ago, and I spent a lot of time talking about the neighborhood councils. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I just want to give one example of what happened in these neighborhood councils and then get to the bulk of my argument. So this was a neighborhood council location. It was this church on the corner here. I didn't have any good pictures, so I pulled it off of Google Maps, and the church actually still looks very similar to the way it looked when I was there back in 2003 and 2004. And I'll say more about this, why this image is important in just a minute. But let me just say the people that were elected to the neighborhood council and the meetings that were held here mostly consisted of pastors, former gang members, school teachers, city officials, and people that were affiliated with nonprofits. That was the elected group of people that ran that particular neighborhood council. Now, why are we talking about neighborhood councils in politics? And I think the key to a fair criminal justice system, as I mentioned at the beginning, is connected to meaningful participation in the municipal political process. And here I'm thinking of a guy by the name of William Stuntz, who wrote this book called The Collapse of the American Criminal Justice System. And in that book, just very briefly, he says when you compare European ethnics between the period of about 1830 to 1930, they had lower rates of incarceration and lower rates of crime. And when we compare them to African Americans who came out of the South after World War II, crime and incarceration was noticeably higher. And so he says, how do we explain this? And so for Stuntz, the key is political machines. That was the vehicle that allowed for a fairer criminal justice system. It had lower rates of incarceration and crime compared to African Americans. More importantly, the police, the DA, and judges were intimately connected to the community, and it exercised more leniency during that period. And also there was a means for mobility. People could get jobs through the machines, and it created less of an incentive to commit crime. This was certainly not the case for African Americans, and it certainly wasn't the case for Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, by the time we fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, the progressive movement is in full effect, and we get a reform style of government that comes out of the progressive movement. And just very briefly, The reform system mostly served homeowners, it mostly served business owners, and it supported growth coalitions, and it was never meant to be inclusive of African Americans, of Latinos, and of working class people. So from the very get-go, it's hard to say that people had a chance of having meaningful political participation to keep criminal justice in a kind of fair way. So what happens? Well, all this comes to a head in 1992 with the riots, or the uprisings, as some people would rather call them. And the uprisings, basically, one of the things that came out of what happened in 92 was that there was a need for more political representation and for outlets for African Americans and Latinos. Then after this, there was a secession movement. They wanted to divide LA in half. And so the thing that was supposed to rescue it was the reform charter that had 3 tiers of government. It had a mayor, it had a city council, and it had the Los Angeles neighborhood councils. And the neighborhood councils were essentially a way of bringing City Hall to the neighborhood, right? And they were supposed to represent about 10,000 people. So I spent a lot of time at these places, and I found them to be, I admire what the neighborhood councils were trying to do. They did a lot of fantastic work, but in the end, there was 2 problems with the neighborhood councils. They had limited power, they only had advisory power, and the other thing was it was still very much a top-down form of governance. So even with this new reform system that was supposed to address issues that we saw in 92 and in 65, the neighborhood councils are still highly problematic. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that it makes it very difficult to keep police and law enforcement accountable in that kind of political system. So as a result, there was less leniency, people were punished more, and police were not as accountable for what they did. And so what I want to do is just give you a sense of what happened at those neighborhood council meetings. And so this is straight from my ethnographic fieldwork, just give you I think one of a high-profile incident that in a lot of ways was a composite of the kinds of things I saw with the police in the community in South Central. So in January of 2004, there was a massive sweep. There was a gang injunction implemented in South Central Los Angeles, and I don't want to go into that too much, but basically a gang injunction is once you've been identified as a gang member, your name goes in a database, you're not allowed to congregate with people, and if you're seen congregating in public, it's a felony offense. So LAPD had identified all these people, and just read a couple of paragraphs in the LA Times of what happened before I go into my observations. More than 400 heavily armed LAPD officers and FBI agents broke down doors and arrested residents in the state's largest public housing project before dawn Wednesday, arresting 41 alleged gang members who authorities said dealt in violence and crack cocaine through South Los Angeles. The raid in Nickerson Gardens targeted leaders of bounty hunters, blood gangs, and capped a year-long investigation by the LAPD and the FBI. So I was in the neighborhood when this went down, and I was spending time at the neighborhood councils, and so this event was really on everyone's mind. So I go to the neighborhood councils, and I wanted to see how were residents going to deal with this particular thing. So if you'll indulge me for a minute or two, I'm going to read what happened at this meeting the next week after this event unfolded. Approximately 50 people attend the meeting. Most attendees are African American, about 5 Latinos are present. The bulk of the people who attend are elderly African American women. A handful of African Americans in their 30s are also present. The building is surrounded by about 10 police cars. Inside the building are 20 police officers standing at every entrance and exit of the building. The mood of the meeting is intense. Everyone seems to feel like something is going to happen. The LA City Attorney, Rocky Delgadillo, is present along with his aides, about 10 of them, and they're all wearing suits and ties, and they sort of huddle in a corner like a football team, like they're getting ready to play a sport or compete against another team. The department heads from the Southeast Police Division are also there. So then at the front of the table where the elected members of the neighborhood council are at, there was the president. His name was Quentin Droom. He passed away when I was there. And he's the president of the neighborhood council. He sits at the center of the table with other board members facing residents, LAPD, and the city attorney. Drew is an African-American male in his early 30s. He's about 6'6". He's neatly dressed, wearing slacks and a dress shirt and a tie. Drew calmly, passionately speaks into a microphone and asks about the gang injunction and demands that the city attorney explain it to the residents. President Drew asked the city attorney, "How do you differentiate between those in gangs and those who are not?" We have good kids with good grades who play football going to jail. The city attorney responds, we have to prove they're in gangs. President Drew adds, let's get LAPDs in the house to explain this. So an LAPD officer walks up and he motions for this gang expert to come up to the microphone and explain how they identify people who are in gangs. He's a white male in his late 30s wearing an LAPD-issued blue field jacket. He's armed, and his police radio emits sound as he walks up to the microphone. Quentin Jew asks, what makes you a bounty hunter expert? The crowd can be heard sighing in disbelief and laughing at his credentials. He says, I've worked in the projects for 7 years. He says, I know innocent people locked up. City attorney says, if people have a known history, they can be locked up if they congregate with gang members. Many people from law enforcement stand in back of the room. Residents seem fearful of the police. They seem not only to be watching the dialogue, but are also on guard for anything to happen. The mood of the room is volatile as residents grow emotional and angry. An African-American male yells out, you don't know how the community was devastated. Old people and children were traumatized when the raids took place in public housing. Another resident states, why is it when there's an injunction it spills over to ordinary citizens? You need to recognize the volatility in this community. So that was a high-profile event, and there's a couple things I want to emphasize from that observation. Why is that observation important? Well, first off, many African Americans and Latinos viewed the intervention of law enforcement as a form of harassment and brutality, and residents seemed fearful of the police, even though all the people in attendance were law-abiding, honest people. These were people that were civically involved, but they seemed afraid of the police as well. And then the last thing I want to say about this is that, and this has actually turned into a statewide issue, Shirley Weber, the assembly member from San Diego, just did a statewide audit, and it turns out that what LAPD is a common statewide practice now. So they're collecting lots of names, lots of people have their names in this database, they don't know their names are in there. I think they even talked about gang babies. Somehow the LAPD got babies in this database, so there's not a lot of accountability in terms of who goes in there. So I want to emphasize something a little different than most people do when they talk about urban politics. Most people say, well, this is, and I talk about this in my book, that it's hard for people to want to participate, to have meaningful participation in a system when things like this happen. But my point for my book, what I'm trying to show is this, more importantly, compels residents to seek alternative means to deal with violence and to deal with their fear of the police. That's a little bit of a take that I have, and I think that makes that particular observation relevant. So what did people do? So now I want to talk a little bit about what we call under-policing, right? So under-policing is not protecting people from violence in neighborhoods. So if there's a lot of gang-related shootings or if there's a lot of violence, usually the attitude was, you get two versions, right? You get this over-policing that I just talked about where people feel criminalized, and then you get another kind of policing where the police are sort of hands-off and they let the violence sort of just get out of control. So one of the questions in chapter 6 that I asked is, how does under-policing shape the social order? And more importantly, what is the relationship between race and high levels of violence in urban poor neighborhoods? And it got a little cut off here. But what I want to emphasize here is that there's been some research on this, but there hasn't been, some of Martine's work, I don't want to go through all the citations that people have done work on this, some of Martine's work looks at the relationship between race and violence and how it shapes identity, but I want to focus a little more of focus more on the explicit relationship between violence and interracial relations. So here, let me give you an example of what happens in terms of how people respond to under-policing. So here's an example of what happened at the school that I worked at, one of the schools. So one afternoon when school was just about to let out, I witnessed a group of 3 or 4 youth, about 17 and 19 years old, run out of an alley near the rear of the school. A gang intervention worker named Rico, whom I knew doing fieldwork, seemed out of breath and excited as he entered the school, as he told me, "Cid, did you see them kids? They was packing and they were looking for someone on this campus, talking about how they were looking for so-and-so over here. Cid, they didn't know I was a gang worker, but I saw their guns. They were all packing. I knew what was about to go down. I had to be slick." I said, y'all better get the hell out of here. I saw the police in the alley, and they said they were looking for about 4 kids. So I'm naive. I don't really understand what's going on. And I say, were the police really in the alley? And he says, no, man, I just told them that to scare them. I had to outsmart those kids because they would have done something. So school officials were notified, police were called, and this happened all the time at this school. I have another example that I talk about in the book where rival gangs would ride around the school every day during lunch hour, and they would they'd blast their music, they would kind of mad dog people there, and then they would make gestures like this, like they were going to shoot someone. So there's always a fear that a bullet could kind of could come through the school. So lots of youth knew that there was nothing that was going to be done about this particular kind of stuff. So what I argue in my book is that it has a distinct effect on interracial relations. But before I get into that, what I want to do is I want to give you a context of what violence looked like at the field sites where I was at. When I was writing this book, one of the editors said, you talk a lot about, we want to know, what are the numbers? What did it actually look like besides these anecdotal things that you're talking about? So these are the 2 field sites that I had. They're pseudo names. This one, the McAllister one, was in the central part of South LA. This one was in the western part of South LA, which tended to be more African American. So without getting into the statistics too much, there was 31 homicides near this site between 2003 and 4, and then there was 24 homicides at this particular site. And when I say homicides, I'm talking about homicides within a 1-mile radius of the location I was at. I'm not talking about police divisions or precincts. I'm talking about 1 mile around the site where I did my field work. And just to give you a little more context for this, because we all know that poverty is important, this is a map. The legend here has percent poverty. The darker it gets, the higher the percent of poverty. And then these are just kind of legends for the different police divisions in the area. So in a lot of the areas where we see a lot of the violent crime, there was a strong correlation, or you could assume a strong correlation with poverty. So the color is the poverty, and then all these dots here are homicides, which I think is just unbelievable. You wouldn't see this in any other part. In most cities, you just don't see this level of violence everywhere. It becomes sort of normalized. And to give you a little more context of what the violence looked like, this slide got cut off here. These are homicides in 2003 and 2004, and I'll just tell you what the highlights are from this slide. In 2003 and 2004, South LA had half the homicides for the whole city of Los Angeles. And the police divisions in the field sites where I was at accounted for half the homicides in South Central LA. So across the board, an overwhelming number of homicides were concentrated in that area relative to the rest of the city. So if we're talking about context, lots of violence in the neighborhoods where I was at. Okay, so let's go back to this thing that I had mentioned earlier about the relationship between violence and interracial relations. Typically, most people talk about this relationship in terms of this causal relationship, where if you have different racial and ethnic groups, they're competing with one another, maybe in the labor market or over particular goods or resources, and that becomes a source of violence. In my book, I try to flip the causal arrow, and I ask a different question. I explore a different question, and I say, how does violence or exposure to violence shape people's racial identity and interracial? So it's a completely different way of looking at this issue. And let me just say a little bit more about this. So given the constant fear and possibility of violence, what were young people to do? In the following section, I highlight the common response and strategies that they used. One clear way that they responded to violence was in their organized approach. And I think the key point for this part of the discussion today I want to highlight is that when people are faced with violence and danger, the default reaction is to look to other people who seem similar. Who do you feel comfortable with in a time of crisis, right? And it's usually people of the same race, maybe of the same culture, maybe people who speak the same language. That becomes a kind of primary organizing principle. And in the book, I'm not going to go into it too much, but in the book I describe how in the school setting, youth tended to divide themselves along racial lines all the way throughout the day. So when I was standing outside the school watching them, they were divided racially. Inside the classroom, there was an attempt to sort of divide themselves. During lunch, same kind of phenomena, right? So there was this pattern of interracial relations that was very divided, and I suspect that violence had something to do with this type of organization. And let me give you another example from the field notes that sort of illustrate the way this worked out. And I was telling Minkus earlier today, a lot of times some of these observations, I wasn't in the field very long. They happened right away. So this particular event happened, I think, the second day that I started working at a school in the central part of South LA. Someone had thrown a milk carton which hit a Latino boy on the head. 2 male youths, one African American, the other Latino, around 17-year-olds, and another boy, both boys wearing Dockers khaki pants and white polo shirts, that was the dress code, started an altercation. The Latino male confronted the African and asked him why he had hit the other boy with a milk carton. The confrontation escalated into an angry verbal exchange, and in a flash, the two boys jumped up from their chairs, circled one another, swinging their fists, as a mob of mostly Latino and African American youth cheered them on. The scene got louder and louder as the mob of students yelled, "Fuck him up, kick that punk's ass, get that fucking puto." I attempted to separate the two boys, but they kept darting in and out of the crowd, and other students obstructed me. Finally, a female school teacher who was on yard duty waded in and caught somebody by the leg, grabbed somebody by the leg. I was then able to restrain one of the other youth. And even though the fistfight had been broken up, it had sparked group conflict. Latino and African American youth began to divide along racial lines, and they yelled back and forth. And it seemed like the situation might even turn into a riot. Nobody wanted to back down. And then let me describe what happens in the classroom. So I'm a teaching assistant, and I was in the classroom. So this riot happens, or not riot, but this confrontation. So I'm in the classroom, and I'm watching how they're dealing with this, right? Back in the classroom, Black and Latino students noticeably avoided each other, sitting apart, not speaking. Occasionally one would stare blankly at another. Finally, during class, two boys, one African American and the other Latino, sat down in a corner and began talking dispassionately as if they were having a business meeting. Later, I learned that the Latino youth, Skilo, was the leader of one of the Latino gangs on campus, and the African American young man was the leader of a black gang. Their classroom meeting was a form of negotiation. Both Black and Latino youth understood that there were informal rules for handling disputes, which kept the violence from escalating. And these observations, I think, are important because they illustrate how conflict is mediated and regulated by each different racial grouping. And what I want to emphasize here, just to continue, there was a perception by both groups that maintaining a strong sense of identity was key to keeping the peace. The contextualization of violence by the school setting created the conditions in which youth looked to those whom they felt most comfortable with, thereby promoting racial solidarity. As a result, the interracial boundaries that emerged from the threat of violence promoted a relationship between African American and Latinos that can best be described as, and this is an important point, as avoidance. This reflects what I refer to as protection and negotiation. So what I want to emphasize here, this is the main concept of the book. In the absence of having strong connection to institutions to deal with conflict, the youth turn to their own kind of informal rules, and avoidance becomes one of the ways that people deal with the violence. Avoidance connected with this idea of protection and also some element of negotiation. Those are three things that I'd say are key, and three things that run throughout the book as being key pillars or key elements of what I'm referring to as alternative governance. So that's one example of what alternative governance looks like. Okay, let me give you another version, and maybe one way of thinking about this, Martina and I were talking about this, is maybe to think of this as different types of social control. I'm trying to move beyond the conceptual restraints of this idea of social control because there are different variations of it, right? So let me give you another version of what this looks like. I've talked about areas where youth feel like they're under-policed. What happens when you bring two elements together of being under-policed where you don't feel safe, as I just showed in that last example, and over-police together. What kind of social control, what type of alternative governance do you get in those particular types of settings? And here I want to draw on the work of Jerome Skolnick, but in a very different way in which Jerome Skolnick's work is typically used. So Jerome Skolnick wrote this book called Justice Without Trial. He's famous for a concept he came up with that he calls the working personality of the police officer. Let me just say a little bit about what that is. So he says police officers are exposed to violence at higher levels than those in other professions. Danger and violence become the dominant framework not only that defines a police officer, but also their personal domestic lives outside his work. This exposure to violence has important consequences. First, it fosters suspicion and distrust of others. And second, he argues that law enforcement is able to kind of exercise discretion in weaving in and out of the use of force, right? So sometimes it's okay, as we've seen on TV, right? The use of force becomes very discretionary. And so what I want to say here is that for residents in South Los Angeles, there is some ways in which this applies, but there's a very important difference. Residents in South LA, as I try to show in this book, are not just fearful of the street, they're fearful of law enforcement as well. So there's this constant threat and fear of danger, but it's not just the police. And I've done a lot of field work, I've done a lot of work of community policing programs, and I see this over and over in different parts of California. So one of the things that I try to do in the book, I'm not going to go into this too much because I want to get to this concept of street justice, is to show that you don't need to code switch. Oftentimes, if we think of Elijah Anderson's analysis, he talks about being street or decent. And I think what my data shows is there's a space in between. People sort of feel sandwiched between the street and between the criminal justice system. And so I think that code switching, the way that Anderson talks about, doesn't quite capture what residents face. So instead, I argue that we need to think of how residents deal with violence as a continuum of strategies. We don't need to code switch. We need to continue. We think about a continuum of strategies, and I think it is possible to think about things in terms of street. You can be street and also uphold ideas about justice and law enforcement together. They're not contradictory. And so I'm not the only one. I'm not making this concept up. David Harding has this idea in his book. He refers to this as simultaneity. So if you read David Harding's recent book, he talks about inner city African American youth and how they have to deal with competing or contradictory frames. Okay, so what is this street justice? Street justice is another version of what I'm referring to as alternative governance. And the most common, the first part of street justice that I found to be pervasive was this idea of no snitching. And I want to talk about this in a different way than most people talk about this in the media. Numerous interviews were conducted with homeowners to explain how common the notion of no snitching was. I found it to be pervasive among residents from a variety of backgrounds, ages, and races. More importantly, it was common among many residents who were not involved in the criminal underworld, because in some instances there was a credible reason to fear retaliation from gangs and other people in the neighborhood who could use violence. So let me give you an example of what happened when I had just moved to Watts. I wasn't in Watts that long. So 3 African American males in their late 20s approach a man watering his lawn in front of his house who had recently moved into the neighborhood. They tell him they need a car in back of the house because it's theirs. He states he can't give it back to them because LAPD wants it for an investigation. They plead with him, then they calmly tell him, okay, we'll be back. They turn and walk away. Later that night, I look out the window of my room and I notice the neighbor's garage where the car is parked is on fire. The flames are high and I'm afraid the fire is going to jump over to my house because I'm right next door. As I look down the back, I see red flashing lights down the street. There's fire trucks parked all the way down the street. And I talked to the person that I lived with, and I said, and she tells me she heard a dog barking and was certain someone had been trespassing on the neighbor's property, and it was probably the parties involved that we had seen involved in lighting the fire. And then in kind of a weird way, in the morning, I'm taking out the trash, and a homeless woman pushing a cart stops in front of my house. She asked me if I knew what had happened, referring to the fire. And I said, I don't know. And she looks at me straight in the eyes and she says, that's what happens when you snitch. He was going to the police. She grabs her cart and then she just takes off. So what I want to illustrate here is that this example illustrates a shared understanding, not just between gang members, but residents and others involved in the underground economy regarding the appropriate conduct in dealing with conflict. Threats of street violence and the inability of the police to protect people compels people to deal with conflict outside the law. There's got to be a reason why people do things. If you have a rule, there has to be consequences, right? And just as a side note, I interviewed lots of people. I even interviewed LAPD, some of the gang detectives, and it's always interesting when every once in a while what residents told me matched up with what they told me. And so, just a little side note, this detective tells me, he says, a lot of people don't go to the police when there's shootings. And he goes, imagine this. Imagine your brother gets shot and everyone knows who did it. The police pick him up and they release him and he's back in your neighborhood and you have to see this guy every day. Because what would you do? Right? Kind of sets the context for this kind of what happens. Okay, so that's the first part. No snitching. We also need to learn to appreciate another instance of negotiation, because I think too often we focus on how places like South LA are violent, right? That violence is the first way that people respond to things. And what I found when I was in South LA is quite the contrary. Let me just read you an example. So there's this guy named Keith. He lived in a large housing project. He'd lived there all his life. And I asked him about this. We were having a conversation one day, and I asked him, what would residents do if there was a murder? Would they go to the police? He says, if there is a murder, you don't say anything. A lot of rules that sometimes people don't take heed to. And when you violate those rules, you get dealt with, and there are consequences. And I said, well, what happens? And he says, the biggest thing is you're marked as a snitch. You're marked as one forever. There are no 5-year statute of limitations. He says, this could endanger your whole family. In a neighborhood, you could get killed, your mom could get killed, or it depends on the situation and what you did. And I said, someone from one of the other housing projects said that when there's a problem, they usually get somebody to work it out, like a leader or somebody that's respected. And he says, that would be the first alternative. People talking with other leaders. People talk about getting leaders. Those are separate issues, though. That is a neighborhood thing. If the so-and-so projects went and shot up the other projects, to solve that problem, I would have to get a leader or someone respected to holler at the leaders in the gangs and figure out what the hell happened, who did it, because they know. And he says, no information will be exchanged with the police ever unless you're a snitch. He says, I'm not going to go to the police if I got shot. I'm no snitch. That makes me look soft on the streets. I'm going to handle it on the street. That's how it goes. So I think this example is important because it reflects a whole range of strategies that people use to avoid violence, but we don't hear about those. All we hear are the strategies that people use for conflict management that revolve around violence. And I think negotiation is kind of a window into all these unobserved strategies that people use to minimize violence. Okay, the last leg of street justice is retaliation. Some people are saying, well, people do use violence. When does that happen? And so I have a little something that I want to say about that. So sometimes retaliation was used. Sometimes violence was used. So let me just summarize what I've said so far. The alternative social space provided residents with a venue to handle disagreements through mediation, usually among neighborhood leaders. Many believe that informal rules of dispute fuel violence. However, Keith's comment clearly indicate the first alternative to conflict is getting neighborhood leaders involved, not resorting to retaliation as much of the sociological literature suggests. His comment suggests that violence is potentially mitigated by negotiation. Among the urban poor, conflict is as common as it is in middle-class settings, but conflict does not always turn into retaliation. Okay, so let me give an example of when violence is used. So there's this guy, he worked for the city of Los Angeles. He wanted to go by the name of LBM. I let people pick their own pseudonames when I did a lot of the interviews. So, all right, when I call yourself LBM, we'll do that. So I asked him, I said, what happens in the neighborhood when a person is murdered? He says, if there is a murder, people will not say anything. Eyes wide shut, you know. In general, in public housing, a jacket is put on him. Paperwork is sent in the community. If he's well connected in a gang or a family member in a high enough position, nothing will happen to him. Snitches get to work. Depends on your status. If you're well connected in a family, nothing will happen to him. Snitch. What's supposed to happen, though, is a snitch is supposed to get dealt with in an orderly fashion. Meaning, if you're dealing in the world of organized crime, people hustle a cat supposed to get killed. So then I ask him, when people don't want the police involved, who handles the problem? Who handles justice in public housing? He says, usually, throughout the 80s and 90s, and now, random, he's using this word, random acts of violence, drive-bys, even if it's in that particular community. Two individuals got beef, something happened, someone got killed, that's it. It's handled in-house, yeah. Those who have the means of handling the situation in grasp, they handle it. And then I asked him, I said, it seems like there's a street justice and a legal justice. One is the law, the other is unstated, and one just, yeah, so I said, there seems like there's two types of law here. And he looks at me and he says, the same thing that some of the guys in LAPD told me. He says, definitely. The individual who was victimized would determine the punishment for the perpetrator. That's how it's done. But yeah, there is definitely two types of laws. The street law, or more of, it's kind of a play on words, is more of a just us. Not justice, but just us. It's street justice in comparison to the judicial system. You know, it's just us, so we can do it with just us. No way a police officer is ever going to be able to relate to what's going on and having full spectrum of what's going on. So we got to implement it, they do it, and conceal it as much as possible. Okay, so that's when you do get instances of violence. And just to kind of follow up on what I had just mentioned with respect to retaliation. So there's three dimensions of street justice. No snitching, which I'm referring to as, in a sense, is kind of about avoidance and toleration and negotiation. Those represent the dominant strategies. And then I argue when these strategies fail, retaliation is often the last resort. But we don't see that because we don't spend time in the community to appreciate the creative strategies that people use. Okay, so those are just two sort of varieties of what I'm calling alternative governance. You saw an instance of it in the school. You saw an instance of it in public housing. And now, given the time limitations, I'm going to try to wrap this up here. And the first thing that I want to focus on are sort of the theoretical implications of what I've discussed today. The concept of social control I find to be very limited. We need to focus on other ways of understanding the creative strategies that people use to deal with violence and conflict. My concept of alternative governance does something else, though. It goes beyond black and white and shows how violence is mediated by many factors, interracial relations being one of them. There's nothing in the literature, there's very few studies that have focused on interracial relations as a way of sort of mitigating or dealing with violence. We need a 21st century view of urban America that integrates the Latino experience. My book shows how Latino immigrants and native-born go underground to navigate safety from the police in the street. And for Latinos, the difference is they also have to deal with immigration custom enforcement. It's not just the kind of thing we hear in Black Lives Matter. It's what you hear in Black Lives Matter plus the whole immigration thing as well. So it's very similar to the African-American experience, I argue in the book. And the key, one of the things I hope that you take away from this talk today is that it is the interrelationship between these black and brown alternative spaces in urban poor areas that are often overlooked because of our inability to conceptualize them. I think that's very problematic, and you need ethnography to sort of uncover these particular things. The other thing that I want to say is that social order, and this is kind of building on some of the work that Martine does, social order is regulated by different levels of social control that compete with one another. If you read a lot of the works, you don't really get this working concept of how different segments of a community affect one another. And that harkens back to the early community studies in sociology. So what I try to show is that the street, religion, and politics, when you look at the interrelationship between them, it helps to provide insight for a different methodological and conceptual approach to studying the urban poor. And then the last thing that I want to say, or last couple things I want to say with respect to policy, that's one thing sociologists don't always like to talk about. But if you apply for grant money, that's the first thing they want to know, right? You have to think in a different way. We need to start to look at local municipal government in areas where we have high levels of violence in poor neighborhoods. local government is the key to integrating residents. Making the criminal justice system accountable and fair is important. And when it isn't, when people don't have meaningful participation in local government, what I'm trying to argue in the book is that it produces alternative forms of governance. And so one of the questions, I was talking about this to my class earlier this week, and I said, what recourse do communities of color have when they have limited outlets for things like police accountability? What can we do? Right? And I really think that things like increased protest demonstration, and political participation are important. Let me just give you one example and kind of escalate it to the national level. For the first time in this presidential debate, we have candidates talking about criminal justice reform. I can't remember the last time. I know Hillary and Bernie talked about it. In the last debate, there was some discussion between Hillary and Donald Trump. And I think a lot of the rhetoric and some of the ideas you hear from Bernie and from Hillary came right from Black Lives Matter. So the fact that we're starting to talk about criminal justice reform, that's a direct result of protest, that's a direct result of political participation, and that's where we need to start to look. Two more points. The other thing we need to think about is that underprotected communities where we have uncontrolled violence in South LA has implications for race relations. And I think it's very important that we have a human relations component in dealing with violence in our community. It's not just about, so when we talk about wraparound services, we also need a human relations component for people to kind of understand the role of how violence shapes race. And the last thing I want to say is that there are ways in which alternative governance can be tapped into to address violence. I'll give you an example. This is my newest book does this. There's lots of former gang members, there's clergy, there's people that have a certain charisma or recognition in communities, and those people are able to mobilize and leverage resources in a way that maybe city political officials can't. So there has to be, I think, more of a concerted effort for policymakers to tap into, whether it's clergy members, former gang members, because oftentimes they have more legitimacy than police officers do, and they can be used to minimize violence. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you. girls, for women, for sure. And in terms of women's participation